June 23, 1944. The Russian front near Vitebsk. Army Group Center faces 400 kilometers of Soviet assault divisions, heavily supported by American lend-lease armor and aircraft. The Red Army launches attacks against exhausted German lines with full strength, well-supplied divisions backed by massive amounts of aid from the United States. The mechanism is brutal, the same hammer-blow tactics the Wehrmacht had inflicted on them in 1941 and 1942 during the periods of German victories. The stakes could not be higher. The entire central front from Vitebsk to Kiev stands in flames. But even as the German army collapses under overwhelming numbers, even as entire divisions are encircled and destroyed, the individual German soldiers continue to inflict casualties at rates that would haunt Allied commanders for decades after the war ended. This is the story of how three nations built their military machines, and why one of them created what American Colonel Trevor Dupuy would later call the most effective fighting force, man for man, in modern military history. The numbers tell a story that makes professional soldiers uncomfortable. On a man-for-man basis, German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at about a 50% higher rate than they incurred from opposing British and American troops under all circumstances. This was true when they were attacking and when they were defending, when they had local numerical superiority and when they were outnumbered, when they had air superiority and when they did not, when they won and when they lost. Oberstfreiter Friedrich Steinbach crouched behind the stone wall of a Norman farmhouse, his MG-42 machine gun positioned to cover the approach from the hedgerow 200 meters away. The American infantry from the 29th Division had been probing this position for 3 hours, and Steinbach had already changed the barrel twice. The weapon fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so high that individual shots blended into what the Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw. Behind him, Unteroffizier Gustav Weiss coordinated the positions of 3 rifle squads with the practiced efficiency that came from 2 years of combat experience on the Eastern Front. The German army that fought in World War II was not simply lucky or fanatical. It was the product of systematic innovation that began in the aftermath of the First World War, when the Treaty of Versailles limited the German military to 115,000 men. Under the leadership of Hans von Seeckt, the German army retained only the most capable officers. The American historians Alan Millett and Williamson Murray wrote that in reducing the officer corps, Seeckt chose the new leadership from the best men of the general staff with ruthless disregard for other constituencies, such as war heroes and the nobility. This created something unprecedented in military history. While other armies expanded rapidly when war came, diluting their professional corps with hastily trained conscripts, the German army expanded from a foundation of highly trained professionals. Every German soldier was trained to perform at least one rank above his actual position. Non-commissioned officers were trained as officers, junior officers were trained as staff officers. When the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, it possessed a tactical flexibility that its opponents could not match. The foundation of German effectiveness rested on 4 pillars: superior doctrine, exceptional training, technological innovation, and a command structure that encouraged initiative at every level. The doctrine, which foreign journalists would name Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, combined tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support in coordinated attacks against enemy weak points. But it was more than just combined arms tactics. The German concept of Schwerpunkt, or center of gravity, called for concentrating maximum force at the decisive point while economy of force held other sectors. Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter stood in the turret of his Panzer IV, studying the terrain ahead through his field glasses. His tank company was the spearhead of the 7th Panzer Division's advance through the Ardennes forest in May 1940. The French had considered this terrain impassable for armor, but German engineers had spent months planning routes through the dense woods. Behind Richter, a column of tanks, half-tracks, and motorized artillery stretched back 5 kilometers. Each vehicle commander had a radio, each crew knew their specific objectives, and each unit was prepared to adapt when the situation changed. The radio was perhaps the most important technological edge the Germans possessed in the early war. While French tanks communicated with flag signals and British commanders shouted orders over the engine noise, German panzer crews coordinated their movements with precision. Tank commanders could call for artillery support, request airstrikes, or redirect their advance based on real-time intelligence. This communications advantage, combined with superior training, allowed smaller German forces to consistently defeat larger Allied formations. But the heart of German effectiveness lay in their training philosophy. The German military education system, centered on the Kriegsschule officer training schools, emphasized practical problem-solving over theoretical study. Young officers participated in map exercises where they faced constantly changing scenarios, learning to make rapid decisions under pressure. The most essential part of these exercises was the officer in charge, who had to be an experienced leader who knew what he was looking for. He had to be able to ask at any time, without warning, what each participant would do in a given situation. The results showed in combat. German officers and non-commissioned officers demonstrated a consistent ability to seize tactical opportunities that their Allied counterparts missed. They were willing to act decisively based on incomplete information, confident that their training and the mission-type orders they received gave them the authority to adapt their plans to changing circumstances. The British Major General Brian Wildboer-Smith observed that the Germans were willing to act, always. They seldom failed to seize an opportunity offered by Allied error. Machine gun fire erupted from the hedgerow as the American infantry advanced across the open field. Steinbach pressed the trigger of his MG-42 and watched the tracers reach out toward the attacking soldiers. The weapon's high rate of fire created a sound unlike any other battlefield noise, a tearing canvas roar that could break an infantry charge before it gained momentum. In 3 seconds, he fired 60 rounds. In 10 seconds, 200 rounds swept the field. The Americans dove for cover, their advance stopped cold by the firepower of a single two-man team. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across every theater where German forces fought. The MG-42 general-purpose machine gun represented the pinnacle of small arms design, a weapon so effective that its basic operating system continued to influence machine gun development into the 21st century. The gun used a roller-delayed blowback action that was both reliable and fast-firing. Its quick-change barrel system allowed crews to maintain sustained fire for extended periods, something impossible with water-cooled weapons that required elaborate support systems. Through the use of the MG-34 and MG-42, an infantry platoon of the Wehrmacht reached about a firepower surplus of 1.6 against their opponents, which clearly affected fighting power and was responsible for a considerable portion of Allied infantry losses. On Omaha Beach during the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, a single machine gunner with 5 men in support was responsible for 2,000 casualties among American troops. The machine guns MG-34 and MG-42 caused more losses to the Allies than all the so-called wonder weapons from the King Tiger tank to the V-2 rocket combined. The firepower advantage extended beyond individual weapons to the organization of German infantry divisions. A standard German infantry division included 442 machine guns, 135 mortars, 72 anti-tank guns, and 24 howitzers. Allied divisions of the same period had firepower only slightly greater than that of World War I. The German emphasis on automatic weapons and rapid-firing artillery created a tactical environment where small units could hold positions against much larger attacking forces. German tank development followed a similar philosophy of practical effectiveness over theoretical perfection. While Allied tanks often sacrificed armor or firepower for reliability or ease of production, German designers optimized their vehicles for battlefield performance. The Panzer IV, which formed the backbone of German armored divisions throughout the war, underwent constant improvement in response to combat experience. Its 75mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at combat ranges, while its armor provided adequate protection against most enemy weapons. But perhaps more important than the tanks themselves was how the Germans organized their armored forces. The Panzer Division was a combined arms formation that included tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, anti-aircraft units, and support elements all trained to work together. Most other armies organized their tanks into separate tank brigades that required additional infantry and artillery support. Panzer divisions had their own organic infantry and artillery support, which meant that tanks led operations with other arms supporting them, rather than tanks supporting operations by other arms. Oberst Heinrich Kurz examined the tactical map spread across the hood of his command vehicle. His Panzer Regiment was advancing through the Ukrainian steppe in the summer of 1941, part of Army Group South's drive toward Kiev. The red symbols on his map showed estimated Soviet positions, but radio reports from his lead companies painted a different picture. The enemy was withdrawing faster than expected, leaving only scattered resistance. Kurtz made the decision to accelerate his advance, bypassing strong points and driving deeper into the Soviet rear areas. This tactical flexibility was the hallmark of German operations in the early war. German commanders at every level were trained to think independently and act decisively. The concept of Auftragstaktik or mission-type orders gave subordinate commanders the freedom to accomplish their objectives using whatever methods they deemed appropriate. A German company commander who received orders to secure a bridge by nightfall had the authority to determine his own route, coordinate with other units, and adapt his plan based on enemy actions. The contrast with Allied command structures was stark. British and American forces relied on detailed, centralized planning that left little room for improvisation. Orders flowed down through rigid hierarchies, and subordinate commanders were expected to follow their instructions precisely. When German forces disrupted Allied communications or created unexpected situations, Allied units often became paralyzed, waiting for new orders from higher headquarters. This difference in command philosophy reflected deeper cultural and institutional factors. The German military tradition emphasized the concept of the thinking soldier, an individual who understood not just his immediate task but the broader objectives of his unit and his army. German military education focused on developing judgment and initiative, while Allied training often emphasized following procedures and maintaining discipline. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness was not limited to any single service or type of unit. The Luftwaffe demonstrated similar tactical innovation in the early war, developing close air support techniques that turned aircraft into flying artillery. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber could deliver bombs with the precision of heavy artillery, providing German ground forces with responsive fire support that could destroy enemy strong points or break up counterattacks. Luftwaffe pilots received extensive training in cooperation with ground forces. They practiced attacking specific targets designated by ground commanders, learned to distinguish friendly from enemy units, and developed communication procedures that allowed rapid response to requests for air support. The result was an air-ground team that could concentrate overwhelming firepower at decisive points, even when German forces were outnumbered overall. Fighter aircraft operations demonstrated German tactical sophistication in a different way. While Allied air forces focused on large formation attacks designed to overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer numbers, German fighter pilots specialized in small unit tactics that maximized the effectiveness of individual aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was designed for superior performance rather than ease of production, and German pilots received training that emphasized air-to-air combat skills over ground attack missions. Major Gustav Riemer pulled his Bf 109 into a climbing turn, watching the formation of American B-17 bombers approach through his windscreen. His squadron of 12 fighters was tasked with intercepting a formation of over 100 bombers escorted by 50 P-51 Mustang fighters. The odds were impossible by any conventional measure, but Riemer had learned that conventional measures meant little in aerial combat. His pilots knew their aircraft, understood their tactics, and possessed the aggressive confidence that came from superior training. The engagement that followed illustrated both the strengths and limitations of German tactical excellence. Riemer's pilots shot down 6 bombers and 4 escort fighters, but lost 3 aircraft of their own. By the calculations that mattered to Air Force commanders, this was a German victory. The bombers missed their targets, the escort fighters failed to protect their charges, and the German pilots lived to fight another day. But by the calculations that mattered to the war's outcome, it was meaningless. The Americans could replace their losses overnight, while the Germans could not. This paradox defined the German war effort from 1942 onward. Tactical superiority could not compensate for strategic disadvantage. Industrial capacity, resource availability, and manpower reserves determined the war's outcome more than individual combat effectiveness. The Wehrmacht could win battles, but it could not win the war. The German military's effectiveness stemmed from institutional advantages built over decades, not from individual superiority or ideological motivation. The Prussian military tradition emphasized professional competence, technical innovation, and aggressive leadership. The German general staff system produced officers who understood modern warfare's complexities, and could adapt their tactics to changing conditions. German industry, while smaller than that of the Allied powers, was technically advanced and capable of producing sophisticated weapon systems. But these advantages came with corresponding weaknesses. German military culture emphasized offensive action and decisive battle, concepts poorly suited to a prolonged defensive war. German industry was organized for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime mass production. German strategy assumed quick victories that would prevent enemy coalitions from mobilizing their full potential. When the war expanded beyond Germany's ability to control, these weaknesses became fatal flaws. The same tactical excellence that brought victory in Poland and France could not overcome the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. German soldiers continued to outfight their opponents on a man-for-man basis, but faced increasingly impossible odds as Allied material superiority grew overwhelming. Feldwebel Martin Brenner crouched in his foxhole on the Normandy coast, watching American landing craft approach through the pre-dawn darkness. His machine gun company was part of the 352nd Infantry Division, positioned to defend the beaches that Allied intelligence had designated Omaha. Behind him, carefully camouflaged positions held additional machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns, all positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the beach approaches. The battle that began at dawn on June 6, 1944, demonstrated both German tactical excellence and its ultimate limitations. Brenner's company inflicted devastating casualties on the attacking American infantry, stopping multiple assault waves and forcing the survivors to take cover behind beach obstacles. His MG-42 fired continuously for over an hour. The barrel changed 3 times as American soldiers fell by the hundreds in the surf and sand. But American material superiority eventually overwhelmed the German positions. Naval gunfire from offshore battleships destroyed the bunkers one by one. Fighter bombers attacked any position that revealed itself by firing. Fresh troops landed continuously, replacing casualties and maintaining the pressure on the defenders. By evening, Brenner's company had been overrun, its survivors retreating inland to positions that would be overrun again the following day. The pattern repeated across every front where German forces fought after 1942. Individual German units continued to demonstrate superior tactics, training, and equipment, but faced opponents who could replace their losses while the Germans could not. The statistical advantage that gave German soldiers a 50% edge in casualty infliction became meaningless when Allied forces enjoyed numerical advantages of 3-to-1 or greater. Understanding German military effectiveness requires examining not just the Wehrmacht but the broader Axis military effort. Germany's allies demonstrated both the potential and limitations of military innovation in different forms. Japan created specialized excellence in certain areas while suffering from systemic weaknesses in others. Italy's failures illustrated what happened when political considerations override military requirements. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered World War II as arguably the most tactically sophisticated naval force in history. Japanese naval aviation, torpedo warfare, and night fighting techniques surpassed those of any potential opponent. Japanese pilots received training that typically lasted 2 years for carrier operations, creating an elite force of naval aviators whose skills were unmatched in the early war period. Lieutenant Commander Sadao Takami stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the final preparations for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Below him, 183 aircraft were spotted on the flight deck, their engines warmed and their crews briefed for the most ambitious naval air operation in history. The plan required precise timing, perfect navigation, and flawless execution. Any failure would result in disaster for the Japanese fleet and potentially for Japan itself. The success of the Pearl Harbor attack demonstrated Japanese tactical excellence at its peak. The aircraft reached their targets undetected, achieved complete surprise, and delivered devastating attacks that sank or damaged 18 American warships. Japanese losses were minimal: 29 aircraft and 55 aircrew. The tactical effectiveness of the Japanese strike force exceeded even optimistic Japanese projections. But the strategic conception behind Pearl Harbor revealed the same kind of thinking that would ultimately doom the Axis powers. Japanese planners assumed that a devastating initial attack would force the United States to accept Japanese expansion in the Pacific. They failed to understand American industrial capacity, cultural resilience, or strategic thinking. Like their German allies, the Japanese confused tactical excellence with strategic wisdom. Japanese military effectiveness rested on intensive training, superior equipment in specific areas, and tactical doctrines optimized for Pacific warfare conditions. Japanese torpedoes were faster, longer-ranged, and more reliable than those of any other navy. Japanese naval night fighting techniques, developed through years of training and exercises, gave them significant advantages in surface combat. Japanese naval aviators flew aircraft designed for maximum range and maneuverability, even at the cost of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. These tactical advantages proved decisive in the early months of the Pacific War. Japanese forces captured territory from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, defeating British, American, Dutch, and Australian forces with consistent effectiveness. The speed and scope of Japanese expansion astonished Western observers who had underestimated both Japanese capabilities and Japanese ambitions. Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Nakamura adjusted his torpedo sight as the American destroyer approached through the darkness off Guadalcanal. His ship, the destroyer Fubuki, was part of a night attack force attempting to disrupt American supplies to Henderson Field. The long lance torpedo in his tubes had a range of 40 kilometers and carried a warhead twice the size of American torpedoes. When fired in coordination with the rest of his squadron, these weapons could devastate an enemy formation before the Americans even knew they were under attack. The naval battles around Guadalcanal showcased Japanese night fighting superiority at its most effective. In engagement after engagement, Japanese forces inflicted heavy casualties on American and Australian naval units while suffering relatively light losses themselves. Japanese tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming torpedo attacks that could sink enemy ships before they could respond effectively. But Japanese tactical excellence could not overcome the same strategic problems that plagued Germany. Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace losses at the rate they occurred in sustained combat. Japanese training programs could not produce replacement pilots fast enough to maintain the quality of naval aviation units. Japanese resource constraints, particularly oil shortages, limited the scope and frequency of naval operations. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, when American code-breaking allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces for a surprise attack on the Japanese fleet. The battle demonstrated both the potential and limitations of tactical excellence. Japanese pilots and ships fought with their customary skill and determination, but strategic surprise allowed inferior American forces to achieve a decisive victory. For Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, along with their experienced air crews and maintenance personnel. The loss represented not just ships and aircraft, but the irreplaceable institutional knowledge of the Japanese naval aviation community. Japanese industry could build new carriers, but it could not recreate the human expertise that made Japanese naval aviation effective. The contrast with Italian military performance illustrated how political and institutional factors could negate potential military advantages. Italy possessed significant industrial capacity, experienced military leadership, and geographic advantages in the Mediterranean theater. Italian naval architects designed some of the most innovative warships of the war period. Italian pilots flew aircraft that, while not equal to the best German or American designs, were adequate for most combat missions. But Italian military effectiveness was undermined by fundamental organizational problems that reflected the broader failures of the fascist system. The Italian military was divided into competing services that frequently worked at cross purposes. The Army, Navy, and Air Force maintained separate intelligence organizations, supply systems, and strategic planning staffs. Coordination between services was minimal, and joint operations were rare. Colonel Alessandro Corteggiani reviewed the latest intelligence reports from North Africa, noting the buildup of British forces around El Alamein. His staff had prepared detailed assessments of enemy capabilities, supply lines, and probable intentions. But when he attempted to share this information with the Air Force and Navy liaisons, he encountered the bureaucratic obstacles that plagued Italian military operations throughout the war. The Air Force claimed that Army intelligence was unreliable and maintained its own assessment of British capabilities. The Navy insisted that its intelligence sources were superior and refused to coordinate its operations with Army plans. Each service pursued its own objectives, using its own methods with minimal regard for the others. The result was military inefficiency that wasted Italy's limited resources and created opportunities for enemy exploitation. Italian equipment shortcomings reflected deeper problems in industrial organization and resource allocation. Italian tanks were lightly armored and undergunned compared to those of other major powers. Italian aircraft used engines that lacked the power and reliability of German or American designs. Italian ships lacked radar and other electronic equipment that was becoming essential for effective naval operations. But these technical deficiencies were symptoms rather than causes of Italian military weakness. Italian industry possessed the capacity to produce better equipment, but political interference, bureaucratic incompetence, and competing priorities prevented effective utilization of available resources. Mussolini's emphasis on appearance over substance led to decisions that prioritized propaganda value over military effectiveness. The German military's institutional advantages became even more apparent when compared to the problems that plagued their allies. German armed forces maintained unity of command, standardized equipment, and coordinated planning that maximized the effectiveness of available resources. German training programs emphasized practical skills and realistic scenarios that prepared soldiers for combat conditions. German tactical doctrine evolved continuously based on combat experience and technological developments. These advantages allowed German forces to maintain their tactical effectiveness even as strategic conditions deteriorated. German soldiers continued to outfight their opponents long after any hope of ultimate victory had disappeared. Units that had been fighting continuously for 3 or 4 years retained their cohesion and fighting spirit under conditions that would have shattered less professional organizations. Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Richter checked his watch as the American artillery barrage lifted from his company's positions. The year was 1944, the place was somewhere in the Hürtgen forest, and his men had been holding this sector for 6 weeks against continuous American attacks. His company had started the defense with 120 men. 37 remained fit for duty, but they still held their positions, still maintained their fields of fire, and still had the capability to stop the next American assault. This was the reality of German military effectiveness in the late war period. Individual units retained their tactical competence long after strategic defeat became inevitable. German soldiers fought with the same professional skill and tactical innovation that had brought victory in the early war, but now faced opponents who enjoyed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and support. The reasons for German tactical superiority extended beyond training and equipment to fundamental differences in military culture. The German concept of the soldier as a thinking professional contrasted sharply with Allied ideas of the soldier as a disciplined subordinate. German military education emphasized understanding the why behind orders, while Allied training focused on following instructions precisely. This cultural difference manifested itself in countless small tactical decisions that, collectively, gave German forces their edge in combat effectiveness. German soldiers were more likely to take initiative when communications failed. German officers were more willing to adapt their plans when circumstances changed. German units were more capable of coordinated action without detailed supervision. The statistical evidence for German tactical superiority comes from multiple sources and covers all theaters of the war. Trevor Dupuy's analysis, based on extensive study of battle reports and casualty figures, found consistent patterns across different time periods, geographic regions, and tactical situations. German forces inflicted higher casualties than they suffered regardless of whether they were advancing or defending, whether they enjoyed numerical superiority or faced overwhelming odds, whether they had air support or operated without air cover. Similar patterns appeared in individual weapons effectiveness, unit cohesion under stress, and leadership performance at all levels. German machine guns had higher rates of fire and greater reliability than Allied weapons. German artillery achieved greater accuracy and faster response times. German tanks demonstrated better mechanical reliability and superior tactical employment. But perhaps most importantly, German military units maintained their effectiveness under adverse conditions that would have degraded the performance of most other armies. German divisions that had suffered 50% casualties continued to function as coherent tactical units. German soldiers who had been fighting continuously for months retained their discipline and aggressive spirit. German officers who had lost most of their equipment continued to lead effective operations using improvised methods and captured weapons. This resilience reflected the depth and quality of German military training. German soldiers understood their equipment thoroughly and could maintain it under field conditions. German officers understood tactical principles well enough to adapt them to changing circumstances. German units had practiced working together extensively enough to maintain coordination even when formal command structures broke down. The ultimate irony of German military effectiveness was that it prolonged a war that Germany could not win, increasing the suffering of all participants without changing the final outcome. German tactical excellence ensured that every Allied victory came at a higher cost than necessary. German defensive skill forced Allied commanders to expend more resources and accept higher casualties than they had anticipated. From a purely military perspective, German forces achieved remarkable results under increasingly impossible conditions. From a strategic perspective, German military effectiveness served no useful purpose after 1942, when the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production made Allied victory inevitable, regardless of battlefield outcomes. The broader lesson of German military effectiveness concerns the relationship between tactical competence and strategic wisdom. Superior training, better equipment, and innovative doctrine can provide significant advantages in individual battles, but cannot overcome fundamental imbalances in resources, geography, or political alignment. Modern military organizations study German tactical methods not to glorify the Wehrmacht, but to understand the principles that made it effective. Combined arms integration, decentralized command structures, and realistic training remain relevant to contemporary military operations. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental requirements for tactical effectiveness remain the same. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez crouched behind his M4 carbine in the Iraqi city of Fallujah, coordinating with his squad as they prepared to clear the next building. His training emphasized many of the same principles that had made German infantry effective 60 years earlier: individual initiative, small unit teamwork, and adaptive thinking under pressure. The weapons were different, the enemy was different, but the basic requirements for tactical success had not changed. The study of German military effectiveness also provides insights into the dangers of confusing tactical competence with moral authority. The Wehrmacht's professional skill did not validate the political system it served or justify the crimes committed by that system. Military effectiveness is a technical capability that can serve either legitimate or illegitimate political purposes. Understanding this distinction is crucial for contemporary military professionals who must balance tactical effectiveness with ethical responsibility. The German example demonstrates that military competence divorced from moral constraints leads to disasters that technical superiority cannot prevent or justify. The comparative study of Axis military performance reveals the complex relationships between political systems, military institutions, and combat effectiveness. Germany achieved tactical excellence through institutional reforms, cultural traditions, and technological innovation. Japan achieved specialized excellence in certain areas while suffering from systemic weaknesses in others. Italy failed to achieve effective military performance despite possessing adequate resources and capabilities. These different outcomes reflected different approaches to military organization, different relationships between civilian and military leadership, and different understandings of warfare's requirements. Germany's success in creating effective military institutions was undermined by strategic miscalculations and moral failures. Japan's tactical innovations were negated by resource constraints and inflexible thinking. Italy's potential was wasted through bureaucratic incompetence and political interference. The lessons learned from studying Axis military effectiveness continue to influence military thinking today. Modern armed forces emphasize many of the organizational principles that made the Wehrmacht effective: decentralized command, realistic training, technological innovation, and professional military education. But they also emphasize the ethical constraints and strategic thinking that the Axis powers largely ignored. The statistical evidence for German tactical superiority is overwhelming and undeniable. German ground forces consistently outperformed their opponents in virtually every measurable category of combat effectiveness. This superiority persisted throughout the war, across all theaters under all conditions. It was not a matter of propaganda, morale, or ideological motivation. It was a matter of superior military institutions, better training, and more effective tactical methods. Recognition of German tactical excellence does not require admiration for the Nazi political system or acceptance of German war aims. It simply acknowledges that military effectiveness is a technical capability that can be studied, understood, and learned from regardless of the political context in which it occurred. Allied commanders recognized German tactical superiority even as they planned and executed the campaigns that would ultimately defeat Germany. General Omar Bradley noted that German soldiers were better trained and better led than their American counterparts. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery observed that German tactical doctrine was more flexible and adaptive than British methods. Even Stalin acknowledged that German military institutions were superior to those of the Soviet Union in the early war period. These acknowledgments came from professional soldiers who understood that studying enemy capabilities was essential for developing effective countermeasures. Allied victory required not just superior resources, but better understanding of German methods and development of tactics that could neutralize German advantages. The process of learning to fight the Wehrmacht effectively took the Allied armies nearly 3 years of continuous combat. By 1944, Allied forces had developed tactical methods, training programs, and equipment that could match German effectiveness in most situations. But this learning process came at tremendous cost in casualties, resources, and time. The German military advantage was most pronounced in the early war period, when German forces faced opponents who had not yet adapted to modern warfare requirements. Polish, French, Norwegian, and early British forces used tactical methods and equipment that were adequate for the previous war but inadequate for the conflict they actually faced. As the war progressed, Allied forces learned to match German tactical methods while exploiting their own advantages in resources and industrial capacity. American forces developed combined arms techniques that rivaled German methods. British forces created specialized units that could match German elite formations. Soviet forces adopted German tactical innovations while adding their own improvements. But even when Allied forces achieved tactical parity with German units, they still faced the challenge of overcoming the accumulated experience and institutional knowledge of an army that had been fighting continuously for 5 years. German veterans possessed practical knowledge of combat that could not be replicated in training programs, no matter how realistic or intensive. Lieutenant Hans Brenner adjusted his field glasses as he studied the American positions across the valley. This was his 4th year of continuous combat, and he had learned to read terrain, weather, and enemy movements with the instinctive skill that only comes from extended battlefield experience. The Americans across from him were well-equipped and determined, but most of them had been in combat for only a few months. That experience gap was worth more than any advantage in numbers or equipment. The experience advantage was particularly important in small unit leadership. German non-commissioned officers had typically been in combat for 2 or 3 years by 1944, giving them practical knowledge that could not be taught in schools. They understood how different weapons performed under various conditions, how terrain affected tactical movement, how weather influenced combat operations, and how enemy forces typically responded to different types of pressure. This accumulated experience meant that German units could accomplish tactical objectives with fewer resources and lower casualties than comparable Allied units. German soldiers wasted less ammunition because they knew when and how to shoot effectively. German leaders made better tactical decisions because they understood the probable consequences of different courses of action. German units moved more efficiently because they had learned to coordinate their movements under combat conditions. The experience gap also explains why German tactical effectiveness persisted even as German strategic position deteriorated. Individual German soldiers and small units retained their combat skills regardless of the broader military situation. A veteran German machine gun crew could still stop an Allied infantry attack even when the German army was retreating on all fronts. This tactical effectiveness, divorced from strategic success, created a contradiction that puzzled contemporary observers and continues to challenge historians today. How could an army that was clearly losing the war continue to demonstrate superior battlefield performance? How could individual German units outfight Allied formations even as the German war effort collapsed? The answer lies in understanding the difference between tactical competence and strategic effectiveness. Tactical competence is a professional skill that develops through training and experience. Strategic effectiveness requires understanding the broader political and economic factors that determine war outcomes. German military institutions excelled at developing tactical competence but failed to maintain strategic effectiveness. This failure reflected fundamental weaknesses in German strategic thinking that predated the Nazi period. German military culture emphasized decisive battle and rapid victory, concepts that were poorly suited to the global conflict that World War II became. German planning assumed that tactical excellence could overcome strategic disadvantages, an assumption that proved false when facing opponents with superior resources and longer staying power. The same tactical excellence that brought German forces early victories became a liability when the war shifted to a prolonged struggle of attrition. German tactical methods required intensive training, sophisticated equipment, and experienced leadership. These requirements became impossible to meet as German resources were exhausted and German training programs were abbreviated. Allied tactical methods, by contrast, were designed for armies of citizen soldiers who would receive limited training and fight with reliable but not necessarily superior equipment. American military doctrine emphasized standardized procedures that could be taught quickly and applied consistently. British tactical methods relied on superior artillery support and air cover to compensate for limitations in individual soldier training. These different approaches reflected different strategic assumptions about the kind of war each side expected to fight. German methods were optimized for short, decisive campaigns that would end before enemy advantages in resources could be mobilized. Allied methods were designed for prolonged conflicts that would be won through superior industrial capacity and manpower reserves. When the war became a contest of endurance rather than tactical skill, Allied advantages in resources became decisive. German tactical excellence could delay defeat but could not prevent it. Allied material superiority eventually overwhelmed German battlefield competence through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The industrial statistics tell the story of German strategic failure despite tactical success. By 1944, the United States was producing more military aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in an entire year. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1943 than the entire German Navy possessed. Soviet factories were turning out more tanks per week than German industry could produce per month. These production figures meant that Allied forces could replace their losses while German forces could not. Even when German units achieved favorable casualty ratios, they were fighting a losing battle of attrition. Every German soldier killed or wounded was irreplaceable, while Allied casualties could be made good from the vast manpower reserves of the United States and Soviet Union. German industry, despite impressive increases in production under Albert Speer's management, could never match Allied output in any major category of military equipment. German aircraft production peaked at about 40,000 planes per year, while American production exceeded 100,000 annually. German tank production reached a maximum of about 6,000 vehicles per year, while American factories turned out over 20,000 tanks annually. These production disparities reflected fundamental differences in industrial organization and resource availability. American industry was larger, more efficient, and better supplied with raw materials than German industry. Soviet industry, while less efficient than American, was larger than German and could draw on vast natural resources. British industry, while smaller than German, was supplemented by production from the entire British Empire and extensive American aid. The Industrial War was decided by 1943, even though the fighting continued for 2 more years. Allied production capacity had reached levels that made German defeat inevitable regardless of battlefield outcomes. German tactical excellence could slow Allied victory but could not prevent it. Understanding this context makes German tactical effectiveness even more remarkable. German forces continued to outfight their opponents even when they knew the war was lost, even when they lacked adequate supplies, even when they faced overwhelming odds. This performance reflected the depth of professional competence that German military institutions had developed over decades of systematic reform and improvement. The professionalism of the German military contrasted sharply with the amateur enthusiasm of many Allied formations, particularly early in the war. German soldiers were professionals who understood their trade and took pride in performing it well. Allied soldiers were often citizens in uniform who wanted to finish the job quickly and return to civilian life. This difference in professional identity affected everything from weapons maintenance to tactical innovation. German soldiers maintained their equipment carefully because they understood that their lives depended on its reliability. Allied soldiers often treated military equipment as disposable because they knew it would be replaced when it broke down. German tactical innovation continued throughout the war because German soldiers and officers were genuinely interested in military problems and devoted significant mental energy to solving them. Allied tactical development was often driven by higher headquarters rather than field experience, leading to solutions that looked good on paper but proved problematic in practice. The difference was particularly apparent in infantry tactics. German infantry squads were built around the machine gun, with riflemen supporting the gun crew and moving to positions where they could best assist the machine gun's fire. Allied infantry squads typically used the machine gun to support riflemen, leading to less concentrated firepower and reduced tactical effectiveness. Similar differences appeared in artillery employment, armor tactics, and air support coordination. German methods emphasized concentration of force at decisive points, while Allied methods often dispersed available firepower across broad frontages. German tactics sought to achieve local superiority through skillful positioning and timing, while Allied tactics relied on overall superiority in numbers and equipment. These tactical differences help explain why German forces consistently achieved favorable casualty ratios even when losing battles. German methods were more efficient in converting available resources into combat effectiveness. Allied methods were adequate for forces with substantial resource advantages but were less effective when resources were limited. The study of German tactical methods has influenced military thinking far beyond the historical period in which they were developed. Modern infantry tactics still emphasize the principles of fire and movement that German forces perfected. Contemporary armor operations still use the combined arms integration that made panzer divisions effective. Current military training still stresses the individual initiative and adaptive thinking that characterized German military education. But modern military forces have also learned from German strategic failures. Contemporary military doctrine emphasizes the importance of understanding political objectives and resource constraints. Modern military leaders are trained to think about warfare in political and economic terms, not just tactical and operational ones. The German example demonstrates both the potential and limitations of military excellence. Superior tactical competence can provide significant advantages in individual battles and campaigns, but cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. Military effectiveness must be balanced with political wisdom and moral constraints to achieve lasting success. For contemporary military professionals, the study of German tactical methods provides valuable insights into the requirements for combat effectiveness. For historians and political scientists, German military performance illustrates the complex relationships between military institutions, political systems, and strategic outcomes. The acknowledgement by Allied generals that Wehrmacht soldiers were superior on a man-for-man basis was not a concession to enemy propaganda or an expression of defeatist sentiment. It was a professional recognition of tactical reality that helped Allied commanders develop effective countermeasures and ultimately win the war. Understanding German tactical superiority does not require accepting German political goals or approving of German methods. It simply requires acknowledging that military effectiveness is a professional capability that can be studied objectively and learned from regardless of the political context in which it occurred. The lessons of German military effectiveness remain relevant for understanding contemporary conflicts and preparing for future ones. Military institutions that emphasize professional competence, realistic training, and adaptive thinking will be more effective than those that rely primarily on superior numbers or equipment. But tactical excellence must be combined with strategic wisdom and ethical constraints to achieve legitimate political objectives. The statistical evidence is clear and undeniable. German ground forces consistently outperformed their opponents in virtually every measurable category of combat effectiveness throughout World War II. This superiority was not a matter of propaganda or perception, but of measurable tactical competence that Allied commanders had to acknowledge and overcome. Recognition of this tactical superiority provides a more complete understanding of why World War II unfolded as it did, why it lasted as long as it did, and why Allied victory required such tremendous sacrifices in blood and treasure. The war was not simply a contest between good and evil, but a complex struggle between different military systems, different strategic approaches, and different understandings of warfare itself. The final measure of German tactical effectiveness was not the number of battles won or lost, but the extent to which German methods influenced the development of modern military institutions. Contemporary armies around the world use tactical methods, training programs, and organizational structures that owe much to German innovations. The professional competence that made the Wehrmacht effective continues to serve as a model for military institutions that seek to maximize their combat effectiveness within appropriate ethical and political constraints. Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Richter survived the war, returning to civilian life in a Germany that had been transformed by defeat. His tactical competence had served a political system that brought disaster to his country and suffering to millions of people. But the professional skills he had developed, the tactical knowledge he had gained, and the institutional methods he had learned from continued to influence military thinking long after the Third Reich had been consigned to history. The legacy of German tactical effectiveness is complex and troubling, demonstrating both the potential and the dangers of military excellence. It serves as a reminder that professional competence, while necessary for military effectiveness, is not sufficient for achieving legitimate political objectives or ensuring moral behavior in warfare. The acknowledgement by Allied generals that Wehrmacht soldiers were superior represents not just a tactical assessment, but a professional recognition of the standards that military institutions must meet to be effective in combat. These standards continue to challenge military organizations today, requiring them to balance the demands of tactical effectiveness with the constraints of ethical behavior and democratic accountability. The story of German tactical superiority in World War II thus becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a continuing challenge for military professionals who must understand the requirements for combat effectiveness while serving political systems and moral principles that the Wehrmacht ultimately failed to uphold. The tactical lessons remain valid and valuable, but they must be applied within frameworks of strategic wisdom and ethical constraint that the German military of World War II was unable or unwilling to maintain.